Good afternoon. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program today, December 13th. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev, Mel, Rabbi Chazen, and Carolyn, and myself, I welcome today's guest, Ann Applebaum, and of course, our moderator, Warren Olney. When we planned for tonight's program a few months ago, we had no way of knowing of President Zelensky's visit this week to the United States, or of this week's congressional wrangling, which pits Ukraine funding against U.S. border security in such a divisive and dangerous manner. So having Ann Applebaum, who is especially expert on the war in Ukraine, on this of all weeks is fortuitous and very fortunate for all of us. Next week, our final program for 2023, our 60th program of the year. A week from tonight, December 20th, we will host Franklin Foer of The Atlantic. He will be discussing the topic of his new best-selling release, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. He will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. I again wish those who celebrate a very happy Hanukkah. It is 8 days for those who don't know that. That's why I keep on wishing happy Hanukkah as we meet during this Festival of Lights. Even during these dark times, or maybe especially during such times, we light our menorahs and remember that aspect of Hanukkah, which speaks to the resolve and resilience of the Jewish people over the millennia. When Rabbi Wolpe was with us a few weeks ago, he commented on how difficult these times will be for Jews worldwide, and he was right. My prayer for all of us is to have the resolve and resilience to continue the age-old battle against anti-Semitism and hate and the pursuit of justice. For me, that is the overarching principle of the message of Hanukkah, and I wish you all a good festival. Just a word to thank you once again for your extraordinary response to the email we sent last Friday asking for donations. We're appreciative of your loyalty and generosity. There is still time to make your 2023 donation. All of the funds used are to cover the cost of our America at a Crossroads programs, and we are all volunteers, so there is almost no administrative overhead to these programs. And now, please welcome tonight's moderator, Warren Olney. Warren has spent decades in TV and radio journalism. He was the host and executive producer of the nationally syndicated public radio international weekday program To the Point, which some of you may know from it having been broadcast in newer jurisdictions. It aired for almost 20 years, and for almost as long, Warren hosted our local LA affiliate, LA NPR's affiliate, KCRW, their local public affairs show, Which Way LA. He has won umpteen awards, and most notably a Lifetime Achievement Award conferred at the Golden Mike Awards ceremony held by the Radio and Television News Association of Southern California. He's a terrific interviewer and a great person. Please welcome Warren Olney. Warren?
Thank you, Janice. That's very kind. I much appreciate that introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself and Applebaum and to talk with her as well. She, of course, is also is a much decorated person, a historian, well known also for writing about the challenges of democracy around the world as well as here in this country. We certainly have plenty of our own. Her book, Gulag, about the Soviet concentration camps, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017. Another book, Red Famine, about Joseph Stalin's war on Ukraine. Vladimir Putin isn't doing anything original. And other books are also very highly regarded as well. Her latest is Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, which she discussed last year with Larry Diamond here on America at a Crossroads. She is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and at the Agora Institute. She is a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy. She's currently a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's formerly a columnist and editorial board member at the Washington Post. She's worked for publications in Europe as well. She was born in the United States. She is a naturalized citizen of Poland, and she's speaking to us tonight from Washington, D.C. And Ann Applebaum, and my pleasure and privilege to introduce you.
No, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here again.
Glad to have you. I just want to say to the audience, don't forget that you can ask questions on chat, and I will be able to see those. And later on in the program, or at some point along the way, I'll try to get to them. You get to ask questions too. So we've been asked to talk about a world at war, and this certainly is a world at war. It's hard to know which one to talk about first, but I think the one that is getting less attention than it has, although very today, particularly, and in the last few days, because of President Zelensky coming to the United States, the war in Ukraine has been getting an enormous amount of attention. Given all the wars that we are faced with, including the one in the Middle East, how important is the war in Ukraine?
So the importance of the war in Ukraine really can't be overstated. So the war in Ukraine will determine how the leading autocracies, Russia and China, but also Iran, North Korea, and others, perceive the Western world and perceive, the American-led coalition that has been put together to fight Russia in Ukraine, or to help the Ukrainians fight Russia, I should say. Remember that Putin's goal in Ukraine has never changed. So the goal at the beginning of the war was to take Kiev and to make Ukraine into whether a kind of satrapy or an occupied territory, but in any case, a part of Russia. He very arrogantly believed that he could do that easily. And he imagined that he would take Kiev in a few days and the rest of the country in a few weeks. That was his plan. That failed. And not only that, he had, over the subsequent year, he had to retreat. They retreated first from territory they'd taken near Kiev, then they eventually retreated from Kharkiv and other areas in the south. But the Russians did not drop their goal, and they didn't change their intention. And their intention is to conquer, as I said, conquer all of Ukraine, make it Russian, remove it as a state, or at least remove its identity. And essentially make Russia into a superpower, because that would give Russia, a long border with EU states. It would give it, new territories that would be, new businesses and companies and resources that would be nationalized and taken over by Russians, stolen from Ukrainians. That's what happened, again, in territories that Russia's occupied in the past. Were they to succeed? In other words, were they to fulfill their original mission? Were we to stop aiding Ukraine, and were Ukraine to collapse? What would that look like? There would be not just 2 or 3 million, but I don't know, 8, 10 million more Ukrainian refugees in Europe. There would be the imposition of a totalitarian rule all over Ukraine, just like there is in occupied territories now. So with concentration camps, with mass murders, with arrests of civilians and the arrests of all existing politicians. Zelensky would be arrested or murdered, or he would escape. The Russians would then, as I said, they would take over the businesses, they would take over the resources, they would use it to rebuild their army and restructure it, and then they would keep going. And the example of that success, the smashing of the Western alliance, forcing the West to accept, the destruction of all kinds of rules and laws about human rights and about conventions on genocide and everything else, that would then mean that all of those rules, all those Western ideas were finished. There would be an enormous amount of inspiration for China. The Chinese are watching this war very closely. They also are wondering whether the Western coalition will break up. And if it does, that will give them extra incentive to invade Taiwan or others. The Iranians are also watching it. The Iranians are helping the Russians openly. Their Iranian drones are being used directly in the war. They're also watching to see whether there is such a thing as a Western coalition and whether they will stick by Ukraine. So it is of paramount importance, is very important. And there's this kind of idea around in Washington and other capitals that, well, if we stop helping Ukraine, well, then the war will somehow go away. No, the war will not go away. It will get worse. It will become more bloody. The conflict will become more brutal. And the result will be that we need far more spending, and we need far more weapons, and Europe, will be in, Poland, Romania, the Baltic states will also be in imminent danger of attack. So the likelihood of war spreading increases. So not helping Ukraine doesn't stop the war. It makes the possibility of violence greater. So that to me is why it's so important.
Republicans so far have been reluctant to vote in favor of more assistance to Ukraine, they sometimes say that rather than dealing with Ukraine's security, they're much more concerned with American security. You're saying that the war in Ukraine is a question of American security.
Oh, absolutely. It's about American security, and it will, and the result of the war in Ukraine will have, all kinds of repercussions everywhere. What the Republicans say and what is actually happening is a little bit different. So, I mean, one of the strange things about the current moment is there's actually a majority in favor of Ukraine, both in the Senate and in the House. I mean, you would, if you 3/4 of both chambers would vote to give money to Ukraine. What's happened though is that because the House is now controlled by the sort of however you want to describe them, the pro-Trump or pro-Russian or MAGA Republicans, they see this mostly very in a kind of transactional way, and they say, all right, this is something Biden really wants. A Ukrainian victory would be good for Biden, therefore we're against it. I mean, so I think some of it is just partisanship. If Biden likes this, then we don't. I mean, I think it's literally that. I think secondarily, the border is an important issue for them. It's a central piece of their message. The country's out of control, the country's in chaos, and the border is evidence of the chaos. And so, their second idea is, okay, we can get some big concession, not just on funding for the border. I think that was Biden's original idea, that he could give some more money for, I don't know, asylum processing or border control, but they want more than that. They want some kind of policy change about the asylum regime. It's unclear to me now. I've actually talked to a lot of people over the last few days what it is exactly that they want, and they're not really saying. It's almost, and it's not even clear to me whether they want something real or they want some kind of performance, that Biden has to make some big concession, and there has to be some big deal, and then they win something, and I'm not sure, but they want to make that part of the bill. I mean, some of them may genuinely believe this thing about our security first and Ukrainian second, but the border is not really a security issue. I mean, it has security aspects to it, but it's more complicated than that. It's not about America is not imminently in danger of losing its prominence in the world because there are too many asylum seekers at the border, which is what the nature of the problem. So to some degree, the Republican objection is disingenuous. I should say there are real conversations going on. There are apparently very detailed negotiations. They're between the leading several. Chris Murphy, I think, is one of the leaders on the Democratic side. Langford on the Republican side. There is a real negotiation. There's a real argument, and some people who are very close to the inside believe that there will be a deal, and it might not be before Christmas, where they're all due to go on Christmas vacation next week. It might be in January, and I think it's unfortunate, because I'm told that the effect of there being less ammunition and less weapons is already being felt on the ground. So there's some impact already from this failure. Remember, this is an argument that's dragged on now for several months. It goes back to the summer. There is a school of thought that says, Biden should never have split this off from the rest of the budget, which is what, I don't know how closely this audience follows these things, but there was an earlier moment when maybe it could have passed as part of the budget, and then as a concession to Kevin McCarthy, it was split off, and with McCarthy agreeing to do it later. And that's somehow this got caught up in the political process in a way that it hadn't before. And maybe the Democrats made some mistakes there as well. But there, as I said, the irony is there's a majority for help for Ukraine. It's not true that people have lost sight of it or forgotten about it. It's just that in order to get some form of bill through the Senate and through the House, and to get the new House Speaker to put it on the floor, it's felt there needs to be some big change in asylum policy. And asylum policy is a very difficult, sphere of politics.
As you mentioned, and the demand that this somehow be associated with asylum policy has a real impact on the Democratic coalition already, just because the president has said he might be interested in doing something. I don't think he's been in detail about it at all. California Democrats, including the Senator Alex Padilla and one or two of the congressmen who are Congress members who are Latinos, have said, wait a minute, we don't want to do that. And that, not that that endangers their vote for Ukrainian money, but it does make them nervous about the president and give them an opportunity to, when he's trying to run for the re-election.
So it is also possible that one of the purposes of this is to split the Democratic coalition.
Yeah.
I mean, and the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, and really like all political parties, is also a coalition. There are people who have a range of views. And maybe the purpose is to, force something that would be unacceptable to a part of the party. And that's also a possible explanation for what they're doing.
You mentioned the international coalition that is behind Ukraine, and the president said today that I think the United States has contributed to $75 billion since the war began, and he said that others, I'm not sure who he meant, had contributed $100 billion in total. So the United States is not the dominant, well, it is the dominant party, obviously 75 billion is a lot of money, but others have contributed more. How important is that to, well, how important is that? Let me just ask a question.
So it's very important. I mean, it's the European contribution that is, that I think he was talking about. So yes,
I think that's right, yeah.
There's a very large European financial contribution to, just to keeping the Ukrainian budget going and weapons as well. I mean, it is the US that's providing the bulk of the weaponry, and that's because the US has more of it and had more of it in warehouses that wasn't being used than Europe had. And I should also say that more than 80% of the money that the US has spent on so-called on Ukraine is actually spent on weapons that are made in the United States. So, and some of them were already available. So it's money spent in the US. It's, that goes to US manufacturers and is spent in states like, Alabama and upstate New York, and, where the big companies are. So it's not like we're sending, suitcases with dollar bills to Kiev. That's not how it works. And the other part of the coalition, mostly Europeans, also Canadians, I guess, and a few and Australians and a few others, South Koreans, has paid more in, kind of cash and financial cost to the war.
You've obviously spent a lot of time talking about what's going on the Hill. Are you surprised by the Republicans in the Senate, not just Lindsey Graham, who has been very outspoken about this, but also about the leader of the minority in the Senate?
McConnell,
Senator McConnell,
Mitt Romney, who's been very clear about Ukraine and has been speaking about it in the last few days. I do find it, I find it shocking that they have agreed to this. On the other hand, as I understand it, one of the reasons they're doing it is to make sure there is a package that will pass the House. So they're, they need some language in this bill to be somehow acceptable enough to Mike Johnson so that he'll, agree to vote on it. And so some of this is that. It's not just that they're, playing domestic politics, although they are. But in addition to that, they are, they need it. They need, because ultimately the House has to vote on it. And so they're waiting for that. And remember, by the way, and it's interesting for this audience, in addition to this, to the Ukraine money in this package, it's also got money for Israel.
That's right.
And so this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about money for Israel, and there's some money for Taiwan as well. So this is a defense and security package. It's, directly, it's very important to Israel as well. And the fact that, it's being held up, I mean, I think is proof of really how far down the road of obstructionism and partisanship the Republicans have gone. Because even Israel, which has been a bipartisan, issue for many years, in which many Republicans support Israel, they even support, Netanyahu. Nevertheless, they're holding up this as well. So I think that shows you just how strong the partisanship is.
What about this question of delay? You said that it might take until January to do something, presumably something ultimately will happen. What's the situation militarily, and how much longer can Ukraine wait to get the kind of support that it needs from the United States? Here's Zelensky himself coming over here and being on Capitol Hill in a very public way. Is there a deadline of some kind with regard to the military situation in Ukraine?
So I don't know that there's I know that some of the part of the U.S. package is financial funding that to support the Ukrainian budget, and I know that that's already a problem, that there are beginning to be questions about will they be able to pay soldiers and pay, that's going to happen quite quickly. The military question, I don't know, because I think it's a little subjective. I mean, clearly, if the Ukrainians have less ammunition and less weapons, they're not going to be on the offensive. They're not going to be taking back territory. They may be able to defend what they have, or defend the current border. The Russians are attacking actually right now quite aggressively in the north, the east. But they may be able to hang on. And I think one of the issues is that if you have less ammunition, you fight differently. They will be much more conservative. They will be more careful. They're not going to, they'll simply, go completely on the defensive. And that's fine. But, should the Russians have a breakthrough, or should there be a moment of weakness, then there could be a kind of domino effect. But I don't know that I can tell you, if they don't have it by January the 7th, X will happen. It doesn't really work like that.
Are there differences in terms of strategy between what the Ukrainians are doing and what the American military thinks they ought to be doing? We're sending people over there. There's a lot of training of Ukrainian troops. Sometimes it's reported that they're not being trained in the right way or for the wrong things.
There are disagreements. I mean, there were a lot of expectations that the Ukrainians would be able to make more progress forward over the summer. But the Russian defenses were more elaborate than were expected. There are thousands and thousands of mines, which are very difficult. And the combination of mines and drones, and this is apparently what the training didn't account for. So if you break through a minefield, if you clear some mines out of the way, the idea in military tactics is that you would clear the way, and then you would have your tanks and your other armored vehicles would go through. But if you break through the line and there's a drone right there that sees you immediately as soon as you do it, and can then, and you can then target that spot with your artillery, it makes a breakthrough very difficult. So one of the things that's happened with this war is that the way it's being fought is already very different from wars of the past. I mean, a war of this scale with this number and quality of drones, is simply a different kind of war than I think even one that the U.S. has ever fought. If you think about it, everything is visible at all times. There are no secrets. Everybody can see everybody else. The whole battlefield is visible, and to both sides. So it's not as in Afghanistan, where the U.S. had much better technology than the Taliban, or here everybody sees everything, and that means that the way of means of fighting is different. I mean, there's maybe not for tonight. I mean, there's a longer conversation about how to break that. And the Ukrainians are beginning to talk about how to change drone technology and what kind of electronic warfare they'd have to use to, take down and undermine Russian drones. But the idea that you could just train, tank brigades and that would be enough turned out to be wrong. I mean, there's a long and involved argument about why the Ukrainians didn't have a bigger breakthrough over the summer. There's some Americans wanted them to go all in one place. The Ukrainians thought that was too dangerous. They didn't want to have all their troops in one place. I mean, and who knows really who's right? I mean, I think a couple of things are clear. One is that the drones are a game changer, and the second is that the Ukrainians didn't have enough equipment fast enough. They had a big breakthrough a year ago in Kharkiv and then Kherson. Had they had at that time enough equipment to keep going, the war might be over by now. but they didn't. You know, we gave them things very slowly on this kind of slow drip, action, and we also didn't give them long range weapons which have turned out to be very important for them to hit behind the lines, and we didn't give them those fast enough. And that's it. That's sorry to be talking about military tactics. It's important because
I asked you about military tactics. That's
I know, but
okay.
it's important. It's also important because it's part of the politics of the war.
Yeah, sure.
That Biden, fairly enough, I think at the beginning of the war said, there are few, we don't want American troops involved, and we don't want this to escalate into a kind of NATO-Russia war, and so a lot of the aid for Ukraine in the beginning was, in retrospect, overcautious. Because as it turns out, Russia probably doesn't want a NATO-Russia war either, and Russia is not making strides in the direction of using nuclear weapons. That was all been kind of bluff. And so maybe had we armed them faster and had things happen more quickly, we might be further along. But the thinking of the administration was, that we were building up slowly to continually test red lines and see who is ready. But I mean, the tragedy is that were the war over by now, we'd already be in a different world. And had they been able to take back more territory faster, it might be. I mean, I don't think, Ukrainians are not losing in that, they've still taken back half the territory Russia took. They've blocked Russian access to the Black Sea, which is kind of amazing. They don't have a navy, and yet they've used their amazing sea drones, these navy drones, water drones, to take out enough Russian ships that the Russian fleet has moved away from Crimea, away from Ukraine. So they have had a number of really remarkable successes. They are not giving up lots of territory right now. It's just that what feels perilous now is the idea that the coalition, which was so important for them militarily and economically and financially, but also psychologically, seems to be breaking up.
How is it breaking up? You mean because of the Republicans in Congress, or?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. money. There's another separate problem in Europe, which is that the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban was blocking. I think that just today that may have been resolved, but the European Union is going to concede something else to him too. He was also using it as a kind of bribe. But I think the point is that it felt for the first year and a half that the war in Ukraine was not ordinary politics. I mean, it was something that was uniting people. It brought people together, actually on the left and the right, and in the U.S. It brought together, Europe and America. And it felt like something that was above and beyond ordinary politics. And what's happened now is that ordinary politics have returned. And as I said, the Republicans think they can use this as a kind of bribe to get something else. They think maybe if they don't do it, it will hurt Biden. So there's a different set of considerations now other than national security.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be a deadline for providing more money, but supposing that it doesn't get there soon enough, and would Russia be able to immediately take over Ukraine and annex it, or whatever the process would be? I don't
know how immediate it would be, but that remains their goal. I mean, this is another piece of the story that is, I think people are confused by. Lots of people say, well, can't Ukraine give up some of its territory and negotiate? No. I think maybe there are some Ukrainians who would do that, but the trouble is that, you have to have someone to negotiate with. There has to be a partner. So we could put lots of pressure on the Ukrainians and they could negotiate, but there needs to be someone on the other side who wants to stop fighting. And right now, there is no evidence that Putin wants to stop fighting. And so the war isn't over until he stops fighting, and he has to, there has to be some kind of political change in Russia, by which I don't mean regime change, but there has to be a political change, and the Russians have to conclude that it's not worth it to continue fighting the war. And the hope was that, a Ukrainian counteroffensive would push the Russians in that direction. But instead we have this kind of vision of dysfunction in Washington, which actually encourages the Russian to keep going. I mean, that's another effect of what the Republicans are doing, is that it's part of, what reinforces Putin's desire to stay in the war. And if he were convinced that we're really going to be there and we're going to step up our aid and we aren't flinching and, the war is going to go on, until it ends, and we'll help Ukraine until it ends, then I think his attitude might be different than to the one he has now.
President Biden has made much of the fact that the Russian propaganda organization said openly that congratulations to the Republicans in Washington. What they're doing is really good for us, and the president has emphasized that a lot. So it sort of strengthens your point that you're making, it sounds to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no question that they watch our politics incredibly closely. When every time Tucker Carlson comes out with another program attacking Ukraine, which he does periodically, they repeat it on Russian television. They've been, telling the story very closely in great detail about the Republicans' insistence on including the border aid and so on. And they cover that, and that's giving them the feeling that, okay, we can stay in the war until we win. If there was solid American support for Ukraine, and if we were sending more and more weapons, then sooner or later, there would be a moment when they would start to flag.
You mentioned Tucker Carlson. I can't help but pointing out that you also mentioned Orban in Hungary, and Tucker Carlson has been very supportive of Orban, went over there, did a program with Orban, and has often spoken about him. Why is that important? Why does it matter?
So Orban is a kind of small d dictator. So he's an illiberal politician who has fixed the voting system and fixed the state media and kind of captured the state, captured the economy in Hungary. And so he can't lose an election. You can't defeat him because the system is, genuinely rigged. He's also quite profoundly now pro-Russian in a sort of organic way. There's some big Russian investments in Hungary. They're very opaque. There's a nuclear power plant, which, nobody's ever seen the contracts that were written to build it. It's assumed that the function of those investments is to, so that bribes and payments are given to the Hungarian ruling party, to Orban's party, and that it has some corrupt function in the Hungarians. Yeah, I should say there are big Chinese investments in Hungary too, which have the same, possibly the same impact. And what's pretty clear is that Carlson is part of a group of American politicians who, actually including Ron DeSantis as well, who admire Orban, and they seek to imitate him. I mean, they admire him for, taking control of his country. They admire him for, destroying the opposition. They admire him for capturing the media. To them, those are all positive qualities. And so he's become a kind of model for the proto-authoritarian Republican right. He also there's another important aspect of Orban, which is also relevant to this, which is that Orban is what he's created is a profoundly corrupt state where sort of his party controls everything, and including, as I said, the economy, and the money cycles back to them. And it's a form of kind of, as I said, elite state capture. But he doesn't ever talk about himself or his government that way. Instead, he talks almost exclusively using this language of culture war. Hungary is defending Christianity against Islam, or against, implied sometimes against Jews. He's run these very anti-Semitic poster campaigns featuring George Soros, and actually now Soros's son. And he uses, we are preserving Hungarian traditional values against whatever you want to call it, globalism, or the elites, or the Jews, or the Muslims. And that's how he talks about what he's doing. In reality, that's a kind of cover for this quite profound, corruption. That's very similar to Putin's own tactics. So Putin has a similar way of justifying what he does as the defense of traditional society, whereas in practice he's a kleptocrat, and he presides over kind of regime of thieves who spend all their time stealing. It doesn't seem very much like a traditional Christian society to me, but they share that quality. They share that way of doing politics. And I think this is also something that Carlson and other Republicans admire. They would also like to, convince Americans that what they're interested in is defending traditional society, whereas in fact, what they'd like to do is create, corrupt deals so that their sons-in-laws can make a lot of money, or them.
in your book, Twilight of Democracy, the seductive lure of authoritarianism, you talk about the lure, how elites gather to some extent, or some of them do anyway, around prospective authoritarians. And is that an example? Is this an example of that? And is Trump himself an example of an authoritarian who is attracting elites who otherwise would be somewhere else?
Yeah, no. I mean, Trump is a kind of magnet for people who see him as a vehicle to something. I mean, to power or to money or to, he's, and he would allow people who would not normally get government jobs because they wouldn't fulfill the requirements or they wouldn't be considered, appropriate, wouldn't ordinarily become, I don't know, Secretary of State or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. People see him as a way to, get ahead, following a different path. And so he's very appealing to, I mean, Mike Flynn is a classic kind of, it's not clear how mentally healthy he is, but anyway, someone who's very conspiratorial, who, couldn't stay in the army any longer because his views were so crazy. He sees Trump as a kind of path to power, and it's done from the beginning.
Let me go to the questions from the audience, because they're always interesting and always good, and I always promise to do it. And here's an opportunity. Robert wants to know, you have predicted, he says, that Trump will abandon NATO and that that would end our commitment to the European alliance. Can Trump do that unilaterally, he wants to know? Or could, obviously this would depend on Trump being elected president, or does he need a vote of the Congress in order to accomplish it?
So he does not need a vote of Congress. The treaties are ratified by the Senate, but there's nothing, no ratification process for leaving a treaty. The important thing to understand about NATO also is that, obviously if Trump started saying, if he were elected president, if he started saying, I will leave NATO, there would be an enormous outcry and there would be political pushback, and it would come from the Senate and from probably the military and from all former Republican leaders of all kinds. But the point about NATO is that although it's a legal document, it's a very, it also depends on a kind of psychological perception. So the NATO treaty just says if one country is attacked, then all the others, who are members of the alliance, then the others are obligated to come to their defense or have to consider coming to their defense. It doesn't say what they have to do. It doesn't obligate anyone to do anything in particular. But the point about this famous clause, this is Article 5, is that it gives the Russians it gives them something to be afraid of. So there's this idea of collective defense. If you attack Poland, America will intervene. If you attack, Finland, Germany and Sweden and, sorry, Sweden's not in NATO yet, but, Germany and France and the US will defend them. And so it creates this, impression, and that's what creates deterrence. So why doesn't Putin just attack Poland? I mean, all those weapons are going into Ukraine, coming through Poland. The reason he hasn't is because he doesn't want to go to war with NATO. Once Trump says, I don't believe in NATO and I will not come to anyone's aid, then the psychological effect of the NATO treaty is gone. So it doesn't matter what the Senate says. It doesn't matter what, who else, what other political pushback there is. It will be gone, because if Trump is the, commander in chief, he's the president of the United States, he's not going to come and help, when Poland's airports and train stations are bombed. Then why shouldn't Russia do it? So the point of the article I wrote for the most recent issue of The Atlantic is that, that actually ending NATO, ending the promise of collective security, is much easier than people think. I mean, all he really has to do is convincingly say, I will not help any of these European countries and I don't believe in NATO. And then that's it. Then it's not it doesn't scare anybody anymore.
John has a question, and maybe it's the fact that, or comes from the fact that the president said today that even though he hasn't gotten what he needs from Congress yet, he was able to send some relatively minor amount of aid to Ukraine. But he says this: given the House Republican obstinacy, does Biden have some sort of Lend-lease type option to supply Ukraine, or does that also require legislation? Again, sounds like he knows about World War II.
Yeah, no, I think there are ways to get some things to Ukraine without legislation. I mean, I think the purpose of this bill was also to send not just weapons, but also to help with Ukraine's, financial balance. It's not just weapons, this particular package. And I think that, as I understand it, that does need, spending that, spending that money does require a congressional decision. I mean, Biden has something called drawdown authority, which he has been using, and he has been taking weapons out of storage. I mean, by the way, a lot of what we've sent to Ukraine is stuff that was going to be, eventually was going to have to be destroyed. I mean, it's, very old ammunition and old artillery, and it isn't stuff that was made just for this purpose. And we are now building more ammunition, and the Europeans are beginning to step up and make more weapons too. But a lot of it was, emptying the warehouses in Nevada, or wherever they are.
Yeah.
And he has had some ability to do that.
Jerome wants to know, I'm as concerned as you are about Putin, he says, but your initial remarks sound like the domino theory that was advanced by the Americans prior to the catastrophic failure of our assault on Vietnam. He says no dominoes fell after the fall of Vietnam. So how is this different?
I think we live in a really different world. We live in a world in which, as I said, Russia and China and Iran, who are the main three most important, but also Venezuela and also North Korea and also a handful of other countries, are now working in tandem. We are not a superpower anymore. We are not, we are a superpower, but we are up against it's a much more complicated world in which we don't have, the battle is not only in Ukraine. So it's not that if Ukraine falls, then I don't know, Moldova falls and Poland falls. That would be the domino theory. It's that if Ukraine falls, then the myth and the power of the collective West disappears. And then you have, as I said, the possibility that China will invade Taiwan, which it's wanted to do for a long time.
Why is that? Why do you make that? Others have made that point as well. Why is it so likely that China will be more likely to invade Taiwan if things don't go well in Ukraine?
Because if things don't go well in Ukraine, that means that there will not be any Western aid for Taiwan. And so, there will not be a reliable Western. And also remember, we're fighting Russia not just militarily, but also financially. We've used sanctions, we've used economic weapons. If none of those things, because and that's one of the things China is worried about. That if it were to invade Taiwan, that there would be all kinds of economic repercussions. And that actually could be a reason why they won't do it now, because they're having some economic trouble right now. But if they see that Russia can outlast the economic repercussions, that the sanctions don't work, that all that language about human rights and Geneva Conventions and laws on war and none of that works. If they then see that you can, with impunity, occupy territory that is not, occupy foreign territory, you can commit massive human rights abuse there, you can lock up thousands of people, you can randomly bomb civilian schools and hospitals, and there's no price to be paid. If they see that happens, then what's to stop them from invading Taiwan?
Here's Eric from Los Angeles. He says, many Republicans expressed concern for the lack of tracking the U.S. money going to Ukraine. I believe the speaker, Mike Johnson, has made that point. And some of the money is going to, they say some of the money is going to Ukrainian companies that are doing badly. Do you think these are valid concerns? Interesting question, given that Ukraine was a pretty corrupt country relatively recently.
Yeah, I think our country is pretty corrupt too now, but it's another, it's maybe a separate issue. So there is no money that's going to Ukraine that's not tracked. most of, as I said, 80% of what's going to Ukraine is not money. I mean, it's money, but the money is spent here in the US.
Yeah.
So almost all of it is weapons. And, and we do track the weapons, and the weapons are not, being sold. They're not appearing in other wars. They're not, drifting away from the conflict zone. They aren't being, privatized in some way. The weapons are being used. So the vast bulk of what we're sending them is that, and the other piece of what we're sending them is direct. Some of it is direct budget aid, which goes into, the Ukrainian central bank, which then uses it to pay pensions, or soldiers' salaries, or, whatever. And that's also money that we're tracking. I mean, that's not money that disappears into some, weird company. We are not sending money to Ukrainian companies to do what they want with it, or letting them. I mean, maybe there's some exceptional case like that, but it's not what the vast bulk of the money is doing.
Paula wants to know if you can comment on the $886 billion defense bill that was passed 87-13 today in the U.S. Senate. I don't know about that.
This is the National Defense Authorization Act.
Okay.
As far as I didn't look at this carefully today because I was doing something else, but I know that one of the other ways in which Biden was hoping to get aid to Ukraine was through that bill, and it may be that that's going to be a counter. That's going to be a counter, another possibility. And there's an argument again on the. I heard I just caught a whiff of a House argument about that bill as well. So the trouble is there are a lot of measures that could pass the Senate, can't pass the House, not because they couldn't find a majority in the House, but because the Speaker won't put them up for a vote. And I think there's some fear about that bill as well.
The structure of our government has been getting in the way of a lot of things. Steve wants to know, can Ukraine win if it doesn't actually attack Russia itself? He says, I realize we don't want to expand the war, but still, he says, ...
So Ukraine has attacked Russia. They've attacked both just across the border, and they've also they have attacked Moscow with drones. There is also quite an extensive sabotage program. I don't know if you follow this, on social media. You could, periodically factories in weird parts of Russia blow up, and that's thought to be mostly the Ukrainians, although it may also be some Russian opposition. So, so there is a. It's not as if they don't, ever hit Russia at all. And they have hit Russian targets also with longer range, with drones and so on. I don't think they need, obviously they don't need to, attack Russia, occupy Russia, occupy Moscow in order to win the war. The war is over when the Russians leave, when they stop fighting. And that can happen for a lot of different reasons. It can happen because of a Ukrainian military success. It can happen because the Russians are no longer able to produce, the explosives or gunpowder that they need to keep their arsenals going, which is, possibly one weakness that they have. It can happen because they are no longer economically able to fight the war. It can happen because they don't have enough soldiers to fight the war. In other words, there may be other ways that we can pressure Russia in addition to, offering military aid for Ukraine. And some of those have worked. I mean, we think that the Russian army is, already, well, certainly the Russian defense industry is already producing less. The Russians have less ammunition now than they did a year ago. They have, their arsenal of weapons has run low. The majority of what they had before the war is already gone. I mean, in fact, already with something like, I think it's 4% of the US defense budget, we've already destroyed something like 60% of the Russian army. So, it's a bargain. But as I said, there are different ways to make sure that the war ends, or to convince Putin to stop fighting. And, we should be pushing in all those directions, doing all those different things.
You mentioned Russian political opposition being responsible possibly for the blowing up of factories. What about Alexei Navalny? He seems to have disappeared. His family can't find him. Nor can his lawyers. Do you have any insights as to what might have happened to him?
So I talked yesterday actually to somebody who is very close to him. who told me that he's not in the penal colony where he was before in the prison. And they don't know where he is right now, but they think he's been taken away from Moscow. You know, he was in a prison near Moscow, then he was a little bit farther away, but they think he's now in Siberia or somewhere in the Far East. And probably the reason for this is that, I mean, I know it sounds insane, you know, but there is a Russian election coming in the spring, and we know who the candidate is, and we know that he will win. You know, Putin will win the election, but he seems to be nervous about Navalny and Navalny's impact on the national conversation in the run-up to elections. You know, Navalny is still the one person who mounted a plausible, wide, you know, large-scale national campaign against Putin and had a lot of success doing it. And he's really the only person who ever did. And I think even Navalny in prison still scares Putin.
Several people have asked this. Can Biden without Congress give those billions of dollars of seized Russian assets to Ukraine?
So this is a really interesting idea, and lots of people are pushing for it. So yes, there are these seized Russian, you know, financial assets that are in, you know, American and Western banks. There is an argument about the legality of doing that and about whether it sets a precedent. You know, if we seize their assets, then they can seize our assets, kind of thing. You know, so there is some reluctance on the part of you know, the international banking community and central bankers to do this. I think that pressure is rising to do this. I mean, I think I should also say there was another idea, which is that it's part of, you know, what levers do we have on Russia? You know, what can we, you know, what impact can we have on them? And I think the frozen money was one of the levers. You know, we have this money. If you end the war, we'll give it back, you know. But I mean, increasingly, there is a lot of pressure to do that. I think, you know, I'm very in favor of it. I also like it because, you know, it would, in a way, it would solve the problem of reparations. I mean, because, you know, what the Russians have done to Ukraine is not only, you know, the enormous economic damage, you know, the enormous, you know, human costs. They need to begin paying back for that. And, you know, if they're not going to do it voluntarily, then one way to do that is to use their assets to help Ukraine. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if that did happen soon. I know that there is you know, this is not my area of expertise. I know there's a big pushback in the financial world against doing this on the grounds that it would set back precedent. But I think, you know, I hope that will be overcome.
You mentioned the loss of so many Russian soldiers. Here's a combined question from Alan and Richard Allen Weissman. They want to know how have Russian losses of men and military equipment impacted Putin's ability to wage war? What is the status of public resistance to the war on the Russian street?
So it's important to understand that there isn't really a Russian street. You know, there isn't a body of popular public opinion. You know, Russians don't see any political choices. They see Putin and there's nothing else. You know, so it isn't like I mean, except Navalny, and they've done their best to eliminate him. And because they don't see that, most of them don't see the point in protest. You know, why would you protest for what? You know, to get what? You know, you know, there's a very profound streak of nihilism, even in the kind of propaganda that Putin does. You know, he does this kind of, they do this fire hose of falsehoods, excuse me, which, you know, they put out lies all the time, changing constantly, you know, giving different view, you know, and one of the impacts of that on the public has been that people become apathetic. You know, they say it's all so confusing. Who knows what's true? I don't want to have anything to do with public life. I'm retreating. And so one of the interesting things about the war is that although it's true there is very little popular protest, there's also very little enthusiasm. You don't see people signing up to fight. You don't see people joining war rallies voluntarily. So it's a very, very passive society right now. I mean, the more interesting question is when the I don't know, the top 10,000. I mean, when does the Russian elite begin to say this is enough? We know that some of them do. I mean, the Prigozhin event, the Yevgeny Prigozhin's, the mercenary who marched on Moscow, that was evidence of that. Some of what he was saying were things that you can hear other people in the security community saying. There are business people, and there are people who've left the country and there is a it's not a popular war. It's not a happy situation. It's just that, as I said, I just don't think people see what protest would do, or at least not right now.
Here's another question asked by several people, and it has to do with Hungary, which is now pro-Putin. I think you indicated that he's moving in that direction, at least. Orban is.
No, he's very pro-Putin. Yeah.
Very okay. So should Hungary be booted from NATO, which was founded, according to some of our audience members, to protect Europe from Russia?
Yes. I mean, it's funny. I just also was talking to a senior American diplomat about that too. I mean, I think it gets discussed periodically whether Hungary should be excluded from NATO. I think that still for the moment, the feeling is that would give Putin a kind of victory, that would look like splintering of the West or something like that. And so at the moment they don't want to do that. But we could get to that. I mean, I think it might actually be quite effective to kick him out of NATO. Because that would, among other things, it would be very unpopular in Hungary. I mean, most Hungarians want to be in NATO, just like they mostly want to be in the European Union, despite Orban's propaganda.
Carol wants to know, how would you assess the effects of Europe's cutting off increasing amounts of natural gas from Russia? Is that significant enough to cause changes on the battlefield?
You mean Europe not buying Russian gas?
Yeah, I think that's what that means, right?
So they haven't bought Russia. I mean, they stopped buying Russian gas. I mean, not everybody.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, at the beginning of the war,
Yeah.
there are still some gas contracts going, but a lot of it was stopped. I mean, and the main impact of that is that Russia has less money. I mean, gas pipelines, unlike oil is fungible and you can sell it everywhere, but gas to transfer gas, you have to have pipelines, and that extensive network of pipelines that went from Russia to Europe can't be repeated so easily. You can't just build them overnight and start selling somewhere else. So it just means that Russian gas production went down.
Susan wants to know, is Ukraine going to run out of people to fight this war? They've lost a lot of people as well.
They have lost a lot of people. I mean, they have still not gone to a kind of full-scale mobilization. There's still a lot of younger Ukrainians who've not been in the army. They haven't. The society is not militarized in that sense. We could get to that next year probably. And yeah, that's one of the other reasons why it would be so important for the war to end faster rather than to drag on indefinitely.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Would you like to make any final comments? Is there any way you could be optimistic or leave us with a positive sense of history?
The Ukrainians are still fighting. They are not going to stop fighting. I think this week the Europeans will announce their package of aid that I think will go through. I mean, this is a personal note because my husband is involved, but there's a new Polish government, which is its main security priority is going to be rallying Europe to help Ukraine. And so there's some hope that the rebirth of the European defense industry, not just about straight defense, but that Europe's kind of strategic and security arms will grow stronger. And that's the main program of this new government. And I'm hoping that could have an impact, if not immediately, then in the medium term.
That's interesting because the growth of the law and taking power of the law and order power in Poland was one of the things you used in your book as an example of how democracies can become authoritarian, but now it's gone back the other way.
It has. So this was like the Hungarian government. This was a ruling party that ran Poland from 2015 until 2 months ago. Well, until today, really. I mean, And they also had a program of state capture, capturing the business community, capturing the media, capturing the judicial system, step by step by step. And they really tried. That was their idea, was to create a one-party state in which they could never lose. And they were surprised by the result of the election, which was in October. And mostly they were surprised because there was an enormous turnout. We had a 74% voting turnout, which is higher than ever before in history. In cities, it was 85%. In one neighborhood, a friend of mine lives in Morris, it was 91%. There was an enormous turnout. A lot of young people voted, especially young women who hadn't voted before, and they lost. And it took them a long time to hand over power, and they they legally extended it out as long as possible. But I mean, literally today, the new government was sworn in.
Thank you so much, Ann Applebaum. It has been wonderful to hear from you. Please promise to come back and talk to us again on America at a Crossroads. Whoever interviews you, we would love to have you, and it's been delightful to have you today.
Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
Okay, same to you.
Thanks.
And same to all of you in the audience as well. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful night, and stay safe, be well, and join us again next week.